We'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for coming today. As you know, the Kansas Supreme Court issued their decision regarding the Gannon case, and that's what we're here to talk about this morning. Joining me are Board President Sheril Logan and Board Member and Senator Lynn Rogers. So, got a few comments to make, and then I'll turn it over to the other two here. As you know, the Kansas Supreme Court has ruled that the current school finance, the block grant formula, is unconstitutional. It does not meet the requirement in the Constitution regarding adequacy, as well as helping students move towards meeting the Rose standards. So it's our responsibility to prepare our students, to educate them based on the Rose standards, to have them prepared to be college or career ready. There are a number of factors that come into play for school districts to fulfill this obligation and expectation, and the courts recognize that fact in their decision. I think it's important that we continue to remind our community as well as our elected officials how important education is to the future of our state. It is the primary economic driver when we think about preparing students as future consumers and employees. Our workforce depends on a solid education. We're not really going to know the immediate impact of the ruling. We know what the court has decided. We know that they've given the legislature until June 30th to come up with a constitutional formula. I know a lot of questions surround what does this mean? What will this mean for school budgets? At this point in time, no one knows. The work of the legislature needs to move forward, and we'll have to see what they put together both in a school finance formula and the ability to fund a formula. And that's a key piece at this point in time. Our state is in a significant financial hole that's predominantly been self-created, and that the legislature is working to try to plug that almost $1 billion hole over the next two budgets, let alone be able to look at once again adequately funding education. So there's a lot of unknowns, and we'll just have to see with time and work of the legislature. 165 individuals will put their heads together and look, and the court also felt that they were more than capable between now and June 30th of being able to come up with a finance formula and revenues in the future to be able to fund a formula, and that's the charge that they've given them. So, it's been a long process to get to this point where school boards have had to make tough decisions around budget, let alone going through the legal process, which has taken us years to once again, 11 times now, for the courts to have to weigh in and get the legislature to do their constitutional duty. And they've done that once again, and it is a victory for Kansas kids as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Logan.
Thank you. This decision is good news. It's good news for Kansas kids, and the new resources could very definitely make a difference. But this decision is not a surprise. It's absolutely consistent, as Superintendent Allison said. The courts have ruled 11 times on this, and the ruling has come up again one more time that the formula is not sufficient. The legislature must take this ruling seriously. It has to find a way to fund education that is adequate in order to support students' mastery of the Rose standards. The Rose standards move Kansas kids far beyond simply knowledge-based. It clearly articulates the expectations for application of information and knowledge that will be needed in the 21st century. We support 21st century educational skills and knowledge. Our kids count on that. Our families count on that. Our business and economic groups find that absolutely essential. We have to prepare our students with the skills and knowledge, and our kids will survive and thrive in the 21st century. We are preparing our kids for tomorrow's world, and that requires additional funding. That's why this ruling is so important. Lynn?
Thank you, Sheril. As Superintendent Allison mentioned, I'm wearing two hats, both as a school board member and as a member of the Kansas legislature as a senator. Probably 12 of the 16 years that I've served on the Board of Education, we have tussled on school finance with the legislature. And so it's really encouraging now, after, again, 11 court cases that have gone the way of the plaintiffs, that we're at this point. Our kids, and what they ruled today is our kids have been receiving an inadequate education. And that's not because our teachers haven't been working hard or our kids haven't been performing, but they have not gotten the resources that they need to get the education that we want and need for the 21st century. I'm encouraged by the example that was set in the special session and with the additional new education-focused legislators that were elected in November, that the legislature will do the right thing when we come back in on Monday. And I really anticipate that we'll get this done by June 30th. We, first of all, can't extend the block grants. Those were ruled inadequate. And we should have been doing a much better job of replacing those, as we promised our citizens 2 years ago when they were created. We were going to take a 2-year process to work on them, and the Kansas Senate, at least, has done nothing in that 2-year period of time. And we're in day 47 of the legislature when we go back on Monday out of a 90-day session. So our task is pretty simple. One, write a new formula or use the old formula that was ruled constitutional, and two, find the money. So that won't necessarily be the easiest thing to do. But I guess what I want to be able to say is that we need to stop playing political games. Again, like we did in the special session, we did what was right for kids. And I hope that the governor realizes that his tax policy is part of the problem with this inadequacy, and that we must stop denying reality as legislators and as the governor, and that we need to work together to solve this. We really cannot shortchange another generation of kids. We've had kids for the last 7 or 8 years that have not gotten the adequate financing, and we have 44 days left of this session. We have 165 legislators and 1 governor that need to do the right thing. And I think as a school board member and as a citizen of Kansas, I'm calling on all of us to do that together. This really will help set the stage for the success of the state. When, as Superintendent Allison mentioned, if we have a strong education system, we have a strong economic development force, people will come to the state, and we will ultimately see recovery from the economic downturn that we've created on ourselves. So those are our comments. We'd open up to any questions that you might have. John, if you want to join us up here again. Sure.
Who's ultimately at fault for how this came to where it is today?
Well, I think your question about fault comes back to funding. The previous formula, had it been funded, the court had said was constitutional. When the funding was not put into the formula, and then when the formula was scrapped and the block grants put into effect, and Senator Rogers is correct, the idea was 2 years to work on a new school finance formula, and nothing happened. So sadly, this is kind of that reoccurring aspect when you think about how many times school districts have been forced to go to the courts to arbitrate, as is their role in our 3 branches of government.
Who instituted that block grant funding? I mean, do you blame them?
Well, I'm not going to use the word blame. It was a conscious decision that the legislature and the governor made at that point in time, that legislative body, to institute the block grant. And it was a way in which, with plummeting revenues and fiscal instability in the state, to guarantee at least a flat funding, which we know isn't really flat for school districts when you have fixed costs that increase every year for that 2-year time period. And we knew that would not meet the constitutional requirement. So that's what happened. This is where we are today, and I look forward to us moving forward and seeing what happens.
With lack of funding, what are some specific things that you all need that you don't have?
Well, if you look at the types of supports, class size, interventions that we've had to scale back for students, particularly when you're a school district with high poverty, and we know that poverty has an incredible impact on children coming to school to learn. The difference between a child coming from a house of poverty versus a suburban school district, research is pretty straightforward. There's a 30 million word gap when they start kindergarten compared to a child coming from a home of poverty. So those are hills and hurdles that we need to get by for those students to be successful. So as you look over the years, as we've had to cut tens of millions of dollars, that has an impact. So being able to provide the social and emotional support, which are part of the Kansas standards when it comes to counseling, college and career, those types of things. Those are the areas that we've had to scale back and that we'll need to take a look at as we move forward if we get some additional funding.
How long will it take to get it back to where you want it?
Have no idea. Don't know what the funding will look like. Don't know, when we look at how quickly that may change. Is it, incremental over a 2-year period, a 3-year period, a 5-year period? So the devil's in the details, and we'll have to move forward once we know what those details are.
But
Lynn, could you
getting that
speak
money
to-
right there, but just getting the money, I mean, there's been years of students.
Let me answer a few other questions, and we'll
Lynn,
come back around.
As a state senator, could you speak to what your next step is to get something done on state finance?
Well, we have a it's now $280 million deficit for this year that we've got to solve. We've had some tax bills that would help us not just generate cash for the 2018 and 2019 years, but it would also generate funds for this year. As you know, that veto was vetoed and was sustained by the lack of 3 votes in the Senate. There is a bill that's there now to reinstate that same law, but not make it retroactive, which only basically brings in about $300 million. It does not structurally fix the budget. So this does put additional pressure. As I've always told people, we've had the two-way view. We've had budget and tax that we have to deal with, and then you have the politics, so it's kind of a 3-way system. Well, now we have 4-way. We've had the school funding. And a lot of us up there have been saying from day one, we need to be working on school funding. That is coming. We know it's going to be here. So again, it's not a surprise, and I think we need to be aware of that. I think the folks that I've talked to, a lot of the new senators, they were willing to wait for this first discussion that we had last week, and again, they were disappointed with the override not going through. But I think the patience will be less, and they're going to want to see a change. I've had some of them even say, if we have to pass the same bill and continue to put it on the governor's desk each week, week after week after week, we may have to do that. So I don't know if there will be that will. I hope there is. It is a bigger task, but I think it's still a doable task, but we've got to face reality. And we, again, saw last week with the veto override that there's still a lot of folks that are in denial of what the governor's tax plan has done.
Yeah, question.
The Kansas Policy Institute president released a statement today, and in part it was saying, basically putting the blame on teachers for education issues, and he said, quote, this is throwing money at the problem and crossing our fingers instead of fixing the problem. What would you all respond to that?
I haven't seen that. I think if you've generalized it as it was printed, I couldn't disagree more, which would be no surprise to anyone. Our focus is on students. It's on what's best for our communities, and that is not necessarily where KPI's focus is typically.
And I guess I would add that, he is one of the highest paid special interests in Topeka, and he's paid to try to keep taxes down and to eliminate that and not face reality. He's not been in our schools. He doesn't understand what's happening in that regard. And, the discussions he has are really alternative facts in most cases.
Could you explain how this decision falls, how the Rose standards comes into play with this decision? You mentioned it briefly.
Anybody want to take that one?
I'm not sure who would be best. 'Cause I'm not all the
I'll
way
start
familiar
it.
with the road.
I'll start it and then let the superintendent follow up. The Rose standards really are a different way of looking at educating students. There are 7 Rose standards that are broken into 5 different categories, and those standards educate the whole child instead of just looking at reading and math and the academic side. So the 5 categories are basic skills, which is basically the kinds of things that we're doing now. Then there's the civic and social engagement category, physical and mental health, arts and cultural heritage, and post-secondary and career. And they apply to every single subject in every curriculum. So they're overarching what's going on out in our schools to prepare our kids for the 21st century. So it's a different way of looking at things. The Kansas State Department of Ed, with their new standards, include these. We are working on them currently in our buildings, and we will be doing different kinds of assessment than we've ever done to be able to make sure that we're reaching those road standards.
How does increasing funding apply to meeting those road standards?
Okay. Let me touch on the Rose standards a little bit. The Rose standards, they're not a curriculum. They're not a standard that said, by 3rd grade a student will know X. They're really what we want our students to be able to do. So they're that umbrella view. And then the Kansas State Board of Education, which is their constitutional requirement, has put the specific standards more around grade level and what we want in specific areas in the Kansas CAN component. So the court has used the Rose standards as kind of that backdrop to say, when we think about adequacy and we think about what needs to be there to constitutionally fund education, it should be that all students have an opportunity to meet the Rose standards. So it's really kind of that North Star pointing to that aspect.
They're not new. They've been in even state statute for years, so it's not a surprise with this court case.
It's just with the court case, the reference to the Rose standard, I think, brought that to the folks that aren't educators to the surface.
Do you have a number or a goal of what you think this district needs in order to get to this point?
At this point in time, I couldn't give you a number. Again, as we look at how will a new school finance formula work, what will the revenue implications be? Is it $5 million for Wichita? Is it $20 million? Is it, those are really different factors. And like we have to do with any of our budgetary items, when we look at what our revenues will be, then we have to prioritize where our greatest needs and how do we match that. So that will be an exciting opportunity as this progresses to be able to think about what are we going to be able to do and to put in place and to support our staff and our students instead of the last really 9 years of conversation have been around the constant cuts and how do we maintain the nucleus of the bare necessities we need for our students. And as Mr. Senator Rogers said earlier, we've had almost a generation of Kansas kids that have gone through school under that conversation. And you still look at the quality that Kansas is able to provide its students in education. It's not where we want it to be, but we've been able to tread water, so to speak, and the idea of what we'll be able to do moving forward, I think is very exciting for the students we have in school now and the students that will be joining us shortly. So the next generation hopefully will have a much brighter outlook than the last 10 years.
How difficult and/or frustrating will it be developing this year's budget? Just in the short term, you're talking about, you've already cut 15 days off the school year. There's struggles with that. You've got a survey out. How hard is it going to be to look at just this next year?
This budget's going to be as difficult as any that we've had because I think the conversation that will occur in Topeka, it's going to take a while. I mean, if you're at the end of June and we still don't know what that's going to look like, the ability of the legislature to raise revenue and to do it in a fashion that brings dollars in fairly quickly is pretty limited. We've always approached that we hope that the worst case would be that we'd have flat funding. Early conversations talked about 5% cuts to schools between now and June 30th. I think the court case probably takes that discussion off the table, I would think. So it's going to be tough. We're going to once again be well into the spring and maybe even early summer before the board's really able to nail down what our budget outlook will be. Now, depending on what happens, we just have to wait and see what happens in Topeka. If we have some answers earlier, then it gives us a chance to work with our budget in a more timely fashion. But sadly, this is where we've been for a number of years, is continually in the spring looking at what our cut targets are and not really knowing what finance will look like. The block grant, this is the second year and it sunsets. The block grant was promised that there wouldn't be any reductions to K-12 funding. So, the minute the legislative session started and the first conversation and finance bill that's out involves a 5% or almost 14 million cut to Wichita, was very concerning.
And I've been reminding my colleagues that if we have this conversation at the board level, we have to talk about cuts because our budget has to be approved by usually the 15th to 20th of August. And so to get everything done in time, we've got to have those discussions in March, April, and May so that we can be ready to publish that budget later. So the longer we take, the more difficult position we're going to put 286 school boards in. It's not just a Wichita school board issue. It's a problem for every school district to come up with their budgets. Some will look at all kinds of ways to cut, and if they're not ready for it, they haven't had those discussions. It's going to be tough to do that at the last minute.
We've always taken the approach that we need to plan for the worst and hope that we don't have to go there. And I don't see that being any different this year, because you have to have those plans in place, and then hopefully you don't have to implement those plans completely.
After several years of cuts, can you talk about some of those places where there is the greatest need in the district?
Well, one of them I could talk about our ability to make curricular changes. You'd like to be on textbook and materials about a 5-year rotation that you're able to review, because as your students progress and standards change, standards are never static. You want to be able to meet that. Well, we're closer to an 8 to 10 year. When you look at say secondary math, we haven't made that change. We're on a 12-year. So that's been difficult to do. It's taken us over 4 years, almost 5 years, to build up enough reserves in our textbook fund that we'll be able to this spring to move forward with the secondary math adoption. So I think those are critical areas. When you look at support areas, counselors, social workers, everything that we need in support of our teachers. Class size has continued to creep up. I mean, it's just been as we've been unable to replace teachers that leave and retire. Each year we replace fewer than have left. So being able to adjust class size, those are some key areas that I think we definitely want to address. Our technology recycle, how quickly we know how technology changes, and just what simple things like Windows and Word and Excel programs require more memory. And when you're using 5- and 6-year-old computers, we get to a point that we can't even look at some software applications for interventions for our students because we don't have the hardware in place across enough of the district to be able to meet those needs. So there have been a lot of those factors. We could spend the rest of the day and I could walk through some of those. And that's where, as eventually as the finances change, we're going to have to sit down and prioritize what are the most important aspects as we need to move forward and develop a plan at that point in time.
One of the things I see on a statewide basis is that teacher morale is low, not just in 259, but every district, and a lot of that's because of pay. We haven't been able to reward them or pay them what they're worth, and that's all staff. Reduced maintenance, things that we're not doing. But even in our colleges, we're not seeing people going into the education college, and that's affecting our ability to hire, ability to retain. People are leaving the profession much earlier than they used to. They're retiring much earlier. those are things that affect us as well. And so hopefully this will help the state address that issue and keep people in the field.
I'll give you another example. When it comes down and you think about the physical structures that are, major investments by our taxpayers, preventive maintenance, our capital funds, over the years we've moved what typically were general fund expenditures more and more into capital. So it becomes harder and harder for us to do the preventive maintenance, to do upgrades and things to our facilities. And that is a vicious cycle, because if you look back to the 2000 bond issue, that was part of what built the need for the 2000 bond issue, is if you can't take care of the facilities, you can't do what you need for roof and replacing HVAC and all those other things, it becomes more costly on down the line. We all know that with the general maintenance of our own homes or our cars, and school districts are no different. And I think that has been pushed back because those dollars have been needed to maintain the core focus that school districts have across the state. And I think that's an area school districts will look at, as once we get the educational side put back in place, then we're gonna definitely need to look at just the facilities and the maintenance component as well.
What's the timeline on that? I mean, if you got all the funding you needed at that deadline, how many years would it take to get maintenance back in place, get students back up to where they need to be?
I couldn't tell you at this point in time. That's a good question, and it would take a lot of study. It's much. You dismantle much faster than you build or rebuild. So I'll give you an example. At our school service center, we've eliminated over 50 positions, right? And that's a sizable chunk of our workforce there. That's 60,000 hours of work a year that we're no longer able to do, and we don't have the funds to go out and hire outside companies to do that. So when you think about how do you build back those skill levels that we've lost, how do we put those pieces in place? It will take us longer than it took, sadly, for us to dismantle it, to do it right, to make sure we're doing it right and doing it efficiently. So, it'll take us 8 months, 9 months, depending on, again, what those details are of how money flows. I think from the state financial picture, I can't conceive a way that that occurs, that we see upfront all the money that comes in within a year. I mean, I would anticipate it's going to be a multi-year process, but that's just my personal opinion. We'll have to wait and see what happens.
So it's safe to say years of damage done to the schools.
Absolutely. I mean, you've had almost a decade. That's not something we're going to fix overnight.
The court rulings looked specifically at achievement gap between the free reduced lunch kids, a third of them not being proficient in math and reading, African American kids to Hispanic kids. What about getting more funding is going to help that?
Again, when you look at what type of supports can you put in place, you look at class size, you look at the ability for professional development for our teachers. I mean, if you go back, those are some of the first things that were impacted. Is the board gave up days that they had, for all intents and purposes, purchased through negotiations as a way in which to provide, when they couldn't provide a salary increase to staff, they at least could provide some time, and those are tough days to get back. So the professional development that's necessary, putting the resources in place, the support structures when we think about our reading specialists and all those types of pieces. We know what we need to do. We know what research tells us has an impact, and that's how we've always stayed focused, and we would moving forward. So, money matters. If you look at sadly the short period of time from the Montoy case where the funding began to increase, you see across the state and in all student categories, you see student achievement begin to rise. And now you've seen, after multiple years of resources being reduced, you've begun to see that stagnation and decline in student performance across the state in all sorts of student categories. So it does matter. And the evidence that was presented in court and that both the trial court and the Supreme Court looked at, they clearly saw that correlation.
I don't know if this has been asked yet, but you get some funding. What's the first thing you spend it on?
You know, again, it's going to come back to how much and when and in what ways. You know, where we will look first and foremost, any increased funding goes to continued support at our schools. We've made cuts. As we've made those cuts, again, tens of millions of dollars, we try to cut as far away from the school as possible, which is really a misnomer, because we support and all exist to support the schools. So as we cut positions, say central administration, we cut over 9%. You know, those responsibilities either disappeared, somebody else picked them up, or they had to settle back down to schools and to teachers and things that were provided for them. So we will spend the dollars focused first and foremost on what will make the greatest impact at the school level.
And Lynn, you touched on this a little bit. You said you're confident the legislature can reach a decision by the 30th. Can you explain why are you?
Well, I think two things. One, we have 35, 40 new legislators in the House and 14 new senators. Many of those were elected on a school education platform and have been the ones that have been fighting the most in terms of returning Kansas to strong education values. And then I think also the pattern that we used in the special session, where the legislators brought in school administrators, school boards, and teachers, and talked with them in terms of what would it take to settle this, to solve this, to resolve this. I think those two things really bode well if we learned our lesson. Hopefully we don't have to relearn it or unlearn it and learn it again. But to me, those are the big things that could make a difference. The other difference, too, is some of those new legislators that we have as well, particularly, in both houses, both Senate and the House, are educators themselves, either retired or currently teaching. And so they know the example. Even myself, I mean, I can stand up and tell people when they say that, schools haven't had a cut, I can list them. I don't have the best memory sometimes, but, I remember lots and lots of cuts, and I know the painful conversations we've had at the board table, and I can remind people of that. So there's a lot more that can do that than ever before.
I know you asked Lynn that question, but I want to give you my perspective as well. Over the last several years, the outreach from the legislature to the education community, school boards, superintendents, teachers, was pretty much non-existent. When we would go to Topeka, it just was not an environment where you felt well received, that your opinions mattered, and that they were going to be taken into consideration. And I could tell you that this year there is a definite change, and I don't say that just personally. I know, talking to other superintendents and school board members, in being more receptive to saying, we want to partner with you, we want to have these conversations, we want to find solutions. So I think from the very beginning the conversations have been different. They've been more open. Issues have been scheduled with proper notice in committees. People have been invited to come and testify, and good questions, and that give and take that's necessary if we're gonna do this. This is complicated, and that's one of those things that a school finance formula should be complicated. And when you hear folks say, "Oh, it's too complicated, we need something simple," nothing about educating children. And when you look at the various needs of our children based on poverty and ethnicity and language and all those other factors, it's going to be complex if we're going to meet the needs of students. And I think there's a recognition of that, and there's been a much more open, cooperative conversation that occurred from the very first day of the legislature. So I think there really was an effort from day one, knowing this needed to be addressed. There's a willingness to do it, and a willingness to partner with schools and boards of education in finding the solutions that are best for Kansas moving forward.
this is a question for you. So you are leaving the school district at the end of this year. The work that you've done to help, I imagine you've done quite a bit of work to help get this case pushed through. It's going to benefit you at your next job as well as every other school in Kansas. Can you speak to that?
Well, this court case is positive for all Kansas students, whether you're in Wichita or Pittsburgh or Topeka, Kansas City, Kansas, wherever that may be. So I think that's the positive piece. This will benefit all Kansas students, and that's really been the impetus. I know with the Wichita School Board and others, while they've taken a lot of shots for their involvement and moving forward with the suit, the ultimate end was that whatever was decided, if it was decided on behalf of school districts, would benefit all Kansas students. And I know our board has always taken that attitude. This isn't just about Wichita. This is about what's right for Kansas and all students across the state.
This lawsuit also covered school districts that represented about a third of all the students in Kansas. So there's quite a few districts that were involved in this for the past period of years.
Any last questions? Again, thank you everybody for coming today. I know this will be a topic of ongoing interest as we move forward, so I appreciate the opportunity to have the first of one I'm sure will be ongoing discussions. So thank you everybody.
Thanks.